Hey everyone, and welcome to your C++ tutorial on switch statements. As you can see, I have Visual Studio Code pulled up here with our Hello World at the ready, our trusty program. All right, I'm going to delete this as usual and kind of give some context around this next tutorial. So what I'd like to do, and this is actually a fairly common use case, is I'd like to handle responses from a web server. If you're not familiar with how the sort of client-server relationship works, a client will send a request to a server, and the server will send a response back to the client, and that response will have a response code, an HTTP response code, and those codes are standardized, so they have a number, and each number means generally the same thing. What I'd like to do is I'd like to write a little program here to handle those response codes. So the idea is that we would be simulating the client. The idea is we send some type of response. They send we send a request. They send a response back. We handle that response. So let's create a quick switch statement. So before we can actually do that, we need to create an integer that we will call response code, and I'm going to set this to 200. So that'll be our response for now. What I'd like to do is create a switch statement to handle that response. And so the idea behind a switch statement is that it is similar to an if statement with an if, else if, else if, else if, else block. But a switch statement is, instead of having all of these different types of expressions that you can pass it, a switch statement just reuses the same equality expression. So what you're going to do with the switch statement is you'll write your switch statement, and then you'll pass in a value, and it'll go through all of the possible matches for that value. And if you match that value, then you can execute a code block in the same way that you would do with an if. So the syntax for that looks like this. We write our switch, and we have our expression that we pass it. In this case, it's going to be our response code. And we have a case statement here, right? And so in this case statement is where we're going to put our potential response codes. And so what I'll do up here is I'll create a list of our potential response codes. We'll just say possible response codes up here. And we could have a 200, and a 200 means okay. We could have a 400, which means bad request. We could have a 404, which means not found. You might be familiar with seeing this one. And we could have a 500, which is server error. So these are going to be our possible response codes, and this is going to be our actual response, right? So let's begin by checking for a 200, and then we are going to write the code that will execute when we check for a 200. So what we're going to do is we are going to print out, since 200 means everything is good, it means okay, we're going to print out everything looks good. Cool. Next, we're going to write another case statement, and we'll do a 400. And if this ends up being a 400, we will write out that was a bad request. Also, now you'll notice up here we have a break keyword here. After we write our instructions for the computer to execute, we need to write the break, because otherwise it will keep going throughout the rest of the case statements. So what's happening here is we're passing in our response code. Our response code equals 200. We pass it into the switch statement. The switch statement is then going to go case by case, trying to match our response code with the case value, right? And if it does match it, then it will run the instruction, and then after it runs the instruction, it'll break and exit this whole statement. Okay, so let's write a couple more cases. We'll do case 404. And if it's a 404, we will say page not found. Oh no. And then we'll break again. Our final case will be a 500. And we will, if it is a 500, we will print out there has been a server error. Frowny face. Okay, so now that brings us to the last part of our switch statement, the default, right? So the default is sort of like your else condition in an if-else statement. So the default in a switch statement kind of catches everything that has not been caught previously, right? So we get our response code, we're going through trying to match it to each case value, and it's like, oh, it's none of these, actually. So we get the default catches it. And so if we can't identify the response code, we'll say that response code makes no sense. Sorry. Okay, cool. So this looks good. Our switch statement is looking good. We're covering all of our possible values here. We have our response code of 200. So let's run it and see how it works. We're going to compile it first. Looks good. We'll run it, and yep, everything looks good. Okay, so we have our response code of 200. It went through the case or the switch statement. It was matched with the first case. We printed everything looks good. Awesome. So now let's try our 404. So we're going to switch our response code to 404. Cool. And let's recompile this and run our new executable. Page not found. Oh no. Perfect. So you can see we have our response code of 404. We pass it into our switch. It tries to match it with this case statement. 404 does not equal 200, so we move on to the next one. Next, 400 does not equal 404, so we move on to the next one. And here we find 404, and that matches, so we printed this out down here. Perfect. That's awesome. So now let's try to enter one. We're going to run that same program, or sorry, my bad. We'll switch this response code to something that doesn't make any sense. We'll switch it to like 700. All right, so that's not one of our cases, so it should hit the default. Now let's compile it, and we can run it. Yeah, so the response makes no sense. Sorry. Perfect. So this is how you use this. How you use a switch statement with an integer. Now let's try to take out one of these breaks. So we'll take out a break and see what happens. You know, we don't have a break there. What's going to happen? And let's put in 404. Right? So our response code is 404. It's going to match with our 404 case, but we don't have a break. So what do you guys think will happen? Let's find out. Compile our code, we run it. There we go. So you can see, oh, and our 500 also doesn't have a break. I didn't realize that. Okay, so that's why you got to be careful. So what happened was we had our 404, and it fell into this instruction, but there's no break. So it printed out this instruction right here. Next, it ran over into the 500s instruction, and it executed this code here. And that executed right here. And then I didn't realize that we didn't have a break there either. And so it fell through the 500 as well and ran our default code at the end here, which is kind of crazy. So yeah, that's a good example of how it can just kind of cascade if you forget your breaks, right? So put in my break here, and I'm going to put in my break here, and I'm going to clear out our console, and I'm going to run this again. I'm going to compile it again and then run it. Page not found, oh no. So it was the same thing, except this time I just had breaks. So yeah, so this is the basics of a switch statement. This is what it looks like, and that's what happens if you don't use breaks. Thanks.